Now, we talk a lot about being disciplined and pushing through, not always feeling like learning a language, but is there actually a time where you should give up on a language you're learning? Is it ever okay to stop learning a language before you reach your goal? And my promise to you is by the end of this video, I'll have explained to you how basically giving up on a language works and when it is a good idea, when it's not a good idea, just so you're not doing something that isn't actually good for you. So let's go. The big question is, I'll start it off with this kind of statement: quitting equals bad. And I think a lot of the time this is true. A lot of people quit things. Obviously, I'm not talking about quitting an addiction or anything. I'm not saying keep your addictions. That's retarded. But a lot of the time people say quitting is bad. And I think that is generally true. But some of the time quitting is a good thing because you've actually locked yourself into something that isn't particularly good. So definitely hit the subscribe button and let's go. I'll also tell you a bonus tip at the end about language learning motivation. When should you quit a language? I do think before you do anything, you need to consider why you want to quit. So I'll introduce you to this idea. If you're a fan of the channel, you probably already heard of short-term motivation and long-term motivation. If not, I'll really quickly explain it in 20 seconds. Short-term motivation is basically what you emotionally feel like doing right now, what you're motivated to do. Long-term motivation is your long-term desires, goals, ambitions, etc., the things that you actually want to work towards in the future. And these two things don't have to always be the same. So you might want to learn a language, but you don't feel like language learning right now. That's an example of you not having the short-term motivation, but you still keep your long-term motivation. If you just don't feel like putting in the work, you're busy, you want to experiment with another language, that kind of thing, that's an example of short-term motivation where you don't emotionally feel like language learning right now. You're not really interested in the language, perhaps. You're really busy, you've got other things on your mind, etc. The alternative would be the chances are with that is that your interest will rekindle, even if you don't particularly feel like studying in the language right now. Odds are, once things change, you get less busy. A bit of time passes, you will actually feel like putting in more work, and you won't regret the fact that you stuck with the language. However, really quickly, I'll address, if you do feel like learning other languages, you can always do a little bit on top of the language, of your main language. There's no rule where you have to stay loyal to one language. You can cheat on the language you're learning. It's perfectly fine. Obviously, you still want to keep it as your main language, or you might not learn as fast if you're juggling like 18 different languages, but you can do a little bit of study on another language if you want. However, there is a time when quitting is okay, and that is if you are learning a language that doesn't align with your long-term motivation, for example, such as your long-term desire might have been X. It might have been to go live in that country, and now it's no longer feasible. You don't really want to do it anymore, and that's not because you just emotionally don't feel like it. It's because it's not a good idea. And potentially you jumped into learning the language, you jumped into a really big goal without actually thinking it through. It could perhaps be better to stop learning that language. I don't think you should burden yourself with any kind of purposeless tasks. I think a lot of people are already burdened with purposeless tasks in their work and things that they just have to do, and it's a really big cause of unhappiness. So if you're one of those people like me, for example, who doesn't quit things and occasionally locks themselves into things that aren't particularly good at them. I used to do this a lot. Now I hopefully don't do it as much. But yeah, if you're one of those people, you know who you are. Don't burden yourself with something purposeless. You need to be on your side. If it is no longer useful for you to study that language and you're not enjoying it or anything like that, you can stop. That's perfectly fine. And you can always, you keep that knowledge, although you might become rusty. Like I'm a little bit more rusty in Italian now than I used to be, simply because I'm not doing it every single day. You do keep that knowledge. It's very easy to refresh, and you can continue learning the language one day. And the number one tip I would give you is just to journal it out. Grab a piece of paper and a pen, or you can do it in your language learning notebook, and just draw all the things around you, what you're interested in, what your long-term motivation might be. Does language learning connect it to your long-term motivation, etc.? And if it doesn't, then potentially that language is something you should drop. If not, you should keep it. If you do want to talk, jump in the Discord with the link below, and I can actually talk to you one-on-one if you want. We can figure out what the best thing might be for you. But now for the bonus tip that I said would relate back to short-term motivation and long-term motivation. It's a little bit more sciencey, but I think it is actually highly, highly useful to understand this, and not just to understand it, but to actually think about it a lot. So I've already mentioned we have short-term motivation and long-term motivation. Long-term motivation obviously depends upon your ambitions, your goals, your desires. For example, to become a polyglot, it could be anything, right? That's what your long-term motivation is. Your short-term motivation is what you emotionally feel like doing right now. And we're specifically looking at chemical dopamine. You've probably heard of dopamine before. It's a hormone that basically, you could call it maybe the happy hormone. That's not accurate really at all, but it's just like the feel-good hormone. When you feel like you want to eat junk food or do something like that, it's because those activities release dopamine. And because you've done them before, your brain knows they release dopamine and it tries to pursue them, which isn't always good for you. A lot of things that release dopamine, like, video games, Netflix, junk food, being lazy, they're not particularly good things, but they do release dopamine, which it's why they're fun and easy to do. So dopamine controls what you feel and don't feel like doing. This means dopamine is actually what's causing your short-term motivation. If you don't feel like language learning, it's because of dopamine. And what I'm going to introduce you to is the concept of basically perceived dopamine. So, for example, when you see junk food and you feel a craving to eat it, it's not because you're already eating the junk food. You're just looking at it. The reason you feel the urge to eat it is because you've had it before and it released dopamine. And so your brain has made that connection that this thing gives me dopamine and therefore it makes you actually want that thing. That's how any addiction works. It's also how things like just wanting to sleep in and stuff work, because it just makes your brain feel better. However, when you see language learning, for example, you have a language learning task you're about to do and you don't feel like it that way, your brain basically perceives this task as low dopamine and it tries to convince you not to do it simply because it sees, just like how if you see, for example, something painful like burning yourself, you have no interest in putting your hand on a hot kettle, right? Unless you're a complete fucking maniac like me. Because it's not going to be fun. You've already formed that neural connection. Even if you've never burnt yourself, you just know that that's what's going to happen because it's just obvious. People have told you since you were a baby not to touch hot things. And that's all because of perception. So when you're perceiving a language learning task as it's not going to be fun today, what actually happens is your brain is convincing you that this is low dopamine, we don't want to do it. However, you don't have to listen to that part of your brain. You can either show discipline and force yourself to do the low dopamine task anyway, or what I try and do is hype it up. So when you don't feel like doing flashcards or reading, for example, because it's low dopamine, what you actually need to do is remember your long-term motivation, remember your ambition, your goal, your desire to become a polyglot, to be able to speak the language and travel there. And don't think about the perceived difficulty of the task. Look through it and see the perceived value in doing this, value in your long-term desire and how this task actually contributes to that. And when you actually start thinking about that, your brain changes its perception of the task and the amount of dopamine it's going to give you, and it becomes a little bit easier. So just remember, when you don't feel like doing something, hype up the task a little bit, think about how it actually delivers on your long-term motivation, and it will become easier to do. But if you are interested in things like that and you want to take your language learning to the next level, definitely check out the Language Learning Accelerator in the description. I'd love to talk with you one-on-one soon. Hit the subscribe button, and thank you for watching.